Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have two very special guests, guys from Data Driven Strength, Zac Robinson and Josh Pelland. This is the second time they've been on. I think last time we chatted about like long muscle length training and then I think specialization phases. I'll have to link that episode in the show notes. But guys, welcome back on. Looking forward to chatting with you again.
Thanks for having us, Jeff. It's good to be back.
Absolutely.
So since last time we talked, it's probably been, I bet, 6 months, if not a little bit longer. Just wanted to get a general update on you guys, see if anything's been going on. Zac, I know you had the big meta regression that came out that spurred a lot of chat in I feel like, I can't think of the word, the science-based, evidence-based training space. And yeah, I know you had that going on, but just curious to hear what's been going on both of your guys' end, training-wise, anything like from work-related, stuff like that.
Yeah, man, I think it's been a good kind of couple months for Josh and I. We've had one of the big semesters of data collection for my dissertation project finished up. That gave us a semester, I want to say off, but a semester of considerably less in lab kind of stuff to do, which has been a nice time to do a lot of the other projects that we've had being neglected and start a bunch of new ones that always continuously puts a bunch of stuff on our plate. But it's an exciting time. We got a bunch of cool kind of projects for school going on and getting started. Josh and the other PhD student in our lab, Jake, are both doing some really cool stuff and getting their stuff rolling. So I'm hopefully coming to my last lap here with school. That is just started 21st grade. I think yesterday was the first day. So it was pretty exciting. But yeah, man, it's been good. It's a little bit of a low time with school, trying to use that opportunity to skills and hopefully push forward with some other cool stuff. Like you said, we published a couple of papers out of our lab, which has been good, and hopefully can continue to keep that track going as we enter the new school year here. So I'm enjoying a little bit of time off, and now I'm going to lose all my hair again as we proceed to the next big data collection period for my dissertation. So what's going on with me? I'm sure it's much the same for Josh. I don't know if he wants to add anything about his personal life on here.
Real quick. Can you hit on what that dissertation is going to be, or is that kind of still,
Yeah. So I think the general broad topic of it is we talk a lot about kind of individualized training and what does individualization mean and all these concepts, both on when discussing programming and stuff. I think that's always a common limitation or things people talk about. And I think that really to date hasn't been like systematically researched too much. And so that's basically the topic of my dissertation, is trying to not only investigate individualization in a really robust way. I'll save the listeners the boring details of how that's necessary and why the very non-traditional study design is required to do that. But we're doing a pretty non-typical training study design that requires subjects to come in for basically do a training study twice is the long and short of it. And that allows us statistically to investigate some things related to individualization. But the cool thing is, hopefully, is that we'll be able to explore some pretty practical predictors for coaches on the responses to different training protocols. In this specific study, the example we're using is training volume. So one limb is doing a higher amount of volume, the other limb is doing a lower amount of volume. And we're seeing if any like baseline practical tests would be able to evaluate which of those two protocols an individual would respond better to. And so that's the long and short of it. Still a lot of work to do yet, but it hopefully will turn out pretty cool as I crawl to the finish line here after we get a few more subjects done. But it's been a cool project. Learn a lot along the way, and hopefully when we get to the end of it, we'll have some cool stuff to report on.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to that. And I know the research process, man, it's just super long and there's just a ton that goes into it. So I appreciate all the work you guys do there with that. But Josh, what about you, man?
Yeah, man, a lot of the same from a high level. Zac is, at least from my perspective, and maybe he doesn't feel this way, he's maybe pushing the ball down the hill in terms of his PhD process. I'm very much pushing the ball up the hill right now. Zac mentioned Jake Remmer, another guy in our lab and a member here, Data Driven Strength. He and I are collaborating on some meta-analyses that we'll hold off on discussing the exact topic, as that process can always take a little bit. So we're chipping away at that. That's been a big project. We are doing a lot of the prep work for our dissertation studies that will be happening in 2024. So we're recording this in August 2023, and you got to think ahead of a lot of things, right? Zac mentioned a break from the actual data collection itself, but for example, like the last handful of weeks, right, we're getting ready for some studies that we're doing like starting next week, establishing good, consistent methods for measuring muscle size and muscle strength, ensuring the protocols are going to work for all the subjects, making sure new students are trained up, et cetera. So like a lot of things go into that process. So break is a strong word, Zach, but we're going to be picking up with another study here in the fall, in addition to Zach's dissertation, looking at essentially high volume, not to failure training compared to lower volume to failure training, which I'm really excited about. That is in the final stages before we start data collection here soon. And then we have, again, some more meta-analysis work in the back end and preparing for essentially preliminary exam / proposal for my own dissertation, which happens in 2024. Good amount of stuff going on. It's all exciting though. So we're very grateful to be part of a lab that gets to study the stuff that we're really interested in. And then of course, also working with some one-on-one clients and putting out some content on a pretty regular basis for free through our company.
Awesome. What about from like a training standpoint? Are you guys focused on anything right now, or is it just backseat to getting all the work done? Or
so for me, I think we talked in Q1 or something like that.
it was
maybe
early in the year.
Q2.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in between that time, I did do a powerlifting meet, which was really nice because
Awesome.
we were able to actually have a little bit of headspace for a meet prep. So that was a good time. Ended up hitting a deadlift PR of 573, which was nice to actually chase a PR and hit a PR. Gonna put that on hold though for now. At the end of the day, I have both strength and hypertrophy goals, and it's hard to do both when in the lab all day, also having a lot of other things to do. So gotta prioritize a little bit, a la specialization like we talked about last time. So right now it's all hypertrophy for me and trying to make it as time efficient as possible. Our lab recently got a tonal machine, which you might have seen commercials about or something like that. And that thing has been just so incredibly efficient for training. Like the difference between loading up a plate loaded functional trainer compared to that thing goes a long way to be able to get a lot of work in a little bit of time. It also has this drop set mode. So you can just like blast yourself with 1 or 2 sets and get a really nice session in 30 to 60 minutes. So that's what it's looking like right now. Basically, very little barbell work, just trying to get as much work in a time constrained period, optimizing exercise selection for hypertrophy the best I can, and just trying to move forward in some way on the training front right now.
That's good to hear about the tonal, because I've had a few people ask about that and I didn't know for sure, but I was like, I mean, it looks like it's just it looks like it's cables basically, right? So
it's essentially cables with electromagnetic resistance, I believe. And could you do like heavy squats on it? No, not necessarily, but you can do, it's been plenty of load for us to do things like rows, even like a seated overhead press, that sort of thing. And yeah, it's been awesome. I think if someone has, I don't know exactly how much it is, I think in the 5,000 to 10,000 range when it's all said and done. If someone has that money to blow, then it is an incredible piece of equipment. So
I think the next version of that is what I'm very excited about. Like I foresee a future where they're gonna have like a Tonal Pro or something like that, which basically is like a little bit extra resistance, maybe a few extra doodads that kind of stick out and let you do like a pendulum squat or something like that. I don't think that's too far off. And I, like Josh said, I've been blown away about that thing. It's been absolutely incredible for pretty much everything except maybe your like compound lower body movements. I think everything other than that, I think it's been like really good. I guess short training update for me. First data collection dissertation, I think I basically became the pretty bad version of myself physically, but now we're back up the hill, been training consistently and hard and been able to push myself for quite a few months now. And I feel like I'm getting close to being back to where I was and trying to knock on the doors of some strength PRs and then also kick the hypertrophy bucket down the road as we go, as always. So yeah, no, I've had a couple injuries, weird health events that kind of put me in that position alongside data collection. And then now I've been able to train consistently and just go in and be able to crush myself for fun for a few months now. I'm enjoying it. I think that's the main thing.
Awesome.
He's underplaying it, man. I think you're squatting like 400 for reps again. So like he's underplaying it. He's looking good, man.
That's good. Yeah, no, I
gotta hype the homie up.
Yep. I feel like it's hard to be like, yeah, I've been doing all this with my training. It's definitely, I feel like you definitely downplay what you do with training wise, just because, I just feel like I don't know. It's tough to be like, yeah, I've been hitting this and that. So can totally see that. But yeah, with the tonal, I know that I'm pretty sure Brad Schoenfeld was like talking about it for a little bit as well too. So that's where I was like, okay, I feel like it's got to have something to it. But funny story, actually, I was at the CSCS or not CSCS, the NSCA National Conference about a month ago, and I went in to do the lat pull down. To get a workout in at the hotel gym. And I'm like, all right, I need to hit that lat pull down. And I'm like, all right, 2 guys are working in on it. I'm like, all right, I'm going to ask this guy if I can work in. All of a sudden he gets up and it's Brad Schoenfeld. And I was like, oh, hey, this is pretty cool. So it's just funny to run into Brad Schoenfeld and ask him to work in.
Yeah, man.
Did you lift more than him? That's the real question.
Yeah, I made sure I saw what he was doing. I just added 5 pounds more.
There you go. There you go.
I had the same introduction to the tonal as well. It was at the ACSM conference, I think a couple years ago now. And I did one set to the house with, I think, the eccentric overload feature. And my lats were sore for 3 days. And I was like, oh, this thing's pretty legit, because I don't think it's necessarily advertised to maybe the average listener of this show, for example. But when I actually looked into it, I was like, oh, wait, you're telling me I don't have to get the 0.25 kilogram plates that we use for research to be as precise as possible with load. And that increases labor hours as well, because you also need to be like changing load within a very constrained rest period time. And I can instead just press a button on a touchscreen and adjust load. Even for research purposes, that goes a very long way. So I'm absolutely thrilled with it, and also excited for the future because of potentially what the technology could be long term.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I could see where that saves some time, and especially from a research standpoint. If you guys had a pick, say you had a home gym and you had that, or the option of I'm sure you guys are familiar with the Prime Functional, where it's got like the cables and the squat rack. What route would you go? And I know that's tough because it's
both are incredible options, right?
So the Prime Functional trainer, can you change the resistance profile on that as well?
I don't know that.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I've never directly used it.
Yeah, I have another. My gut was going to say my absolute opinion at the moment right now is for if you get a home gym, get a squat rack and a tonal. Like that is 100% what I would do at the moment. The price, I'm not sure how that would all shake out. That probably is substantially more with the tonal compared to like maybe a set of adjustable dumbbells. But man, that thing is just so versatile that I just have a hard time thinking that's not. And even if you can go somewhere, if you care about strength, if you don't care about strength, tonal itself is going to be pretty dang good if you can get away with split squats and like some lunge variations for a while. But if you care about strength, go squat, deadlift somewhere twice a week or something like that, and use the tonal at home. Man, this is turning into an advertisement. It's a good piece of equipment. Tonal, shout out. Where's the sponsor at?
Yeah, where's this? Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it's super interesting. That's cool that you're able to do that. But I feel like the legs are always the toughest, like to hit at a home gym, other than like anybody I've talked to that has like a home gym, it's like that's just always the toughest one, because you got to get like specific machines for it other than back squats and lunges. Cool, guys. Glad we were able to touch base and see how everything's going. Again, sounds like you guys are super busy, but still making sure you're training and everything like that. So first topic I wanted to bring up, Zac, I know you've had a lot of talk on this, your training to failure meta regression that you did. I just wanted to bring you on here to chat about it. Maybe if you want to hit on just some general findings, things that you thought were most important. And I know that with it being a preprint, there was maybe some misapplications of it that I know that you want to hit on there. So I'd love to chat about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I'll give a general overview of what we did. So I think the listeners are probably pretty familiar with meta-analysis in general. So meta-analysis is just taking all of the available studies on a given topic, pulling those together and trying to get some sort of overall consensus estimate for whatever the comparison is. And specifically in this kind of research area, the topic of training to or not to failure has been meta-analyzed a few times. The one most recently done that was an extremely useful analysis was by Ruffalo and colleagues, where they looked at not only the comparison of failure and not failure, but they did that stratified by a ton of different failure definitions and making sure that was very cohesively defined, making sure they compared momentary failure to what they called set failure and non-failure. And basically what we wanted to do to add an additional layer of potential insight to this conversation is look at the dose response relationship between proximity to failure and various training outcomes. I think in this conversation, we'll focus on hypertrophy. And so the reason you're doing that is because it allows us to see the actual relationship of every single RAR and how that trends with outcomes, so that we can best use that to inform our understanding, as opposed to just focusing on that binary comparison where non-failures can mean a ton of different things. And so without going into too much detail there in the methods, we obviously can dig into that if you like. In terms of what we saw for the primary outcomes, for the dose response relationship for hypertrophy, there was a pretty meaningful relationship between RAR and outcomes, such that outcomes seem to improve as you get closer to failure. Some people have seemed to think this is in contrast with previous research. I would say that's probably not the case. If you go through pretty much every meta-analysis on this topic up until this point, every single one of the kind of the comparisons, or what we call the effect sizes, do lean in favor of the closer to failure condition. It's just that the way that this analysis was done, the number of studies included, and just the overall statistical approach can lead to a slightly different conclusion. Not to say one is right or wrong, they each have advantages and disadvantages, but ours showed that failure did seem to have a little bit of an advantage just looking at the dose response relationship. For strength, a little bit of the opposite. Basically, the way that the models were created is that they were at a fixed percentage of 1RM. And so when you do that, it basically eliminates the influence of proximity to failure for strength, which basically shows that, and we know this from other research recently, a preprint from Swinton and colleagues of over 100 studies shows a pretty strong relationship between load and strength gains. And so basically, once you've accounted for the load, proximity to failure doesn't really seem to have an independent influence on strength gains. And we can speculate why that's the case, but basically that load seems to be the predominant factor that basically washes out the influence of proximity to failure independently. And so that's the overall relationships that we saw. I don't know if you have any other specific follow-ups. I can go to as much detail as you want. Just depends on where you want to take the conversation.
Yeah, so basically it just sounds like with the hypertrophy side of things, it was like the closer you got to failure on average, that was going to lead to more hypertrophy. So again, if we're comparing 8 RAR to 2, obviously getting closer was better for that. I know there was some things that played a role in it that some people weren't taking into account as well. I didn't know if you maybe wanted to hit on that or anything.
Yeah, I think the main thing that I've tried to highlight over this conversation. So in terms of the methodology and the way that we had to do this, based on the research available, there's a reason that's only been able to be analyzed in that binary fashion of failure and non-failure. And that's just because basically no studies are going to report the actual number of repetitions in reserve for each condition in a way that would be necessary to meta-analyze things in the way that we wanted to. And so what we had to do is go through every single one of these studies individually and estimate the RAR based on a series of procedures. Now, ultimately what that means is that we can't be confident that the RAR estimates are indeed accurate. Obviously, I wouldn't have done the analysis if I wasn't pretty confident that they're close. And I do think this analysis can give us some pretty important context into the overall directionality of the relationship between proximity to failure and outcomes. But nonetheless, the exact RAR values obviously cannot be confirmed through the series of estimation procedures. And with that context in mind, I think it's really important that people don't overinterpret the things that we're looking at. So one thing I've seen on social media pretty consistently is like very specifically comparing the effect sizes for different RAR values and using that to justify certain approaches. I think using that at a very broad level can be informative, but ending up directly influencing protocols based on those very fine granular numeric estimations, I think are subject to quite a bit of error just because of a few of those effect sizes bounce in a slightly different direction. The overall curve or the best fit relationship could change substantially. And as we've gone through the pre-printing process, received a ton of good feedback, we're going to make some adjustments to the upcoming manuscript that we hope to be published that kind of reflect that very unstable kind of exact relationship going forward. And that's one of the reasons in the preprint, because there are so many different approaches you can do to modeling these relationships, there's not a right or wrong here. It's more of an art and things that different people would want to see included in the way that these models are created, including one other variable here or there, or fitting different nonlinear relationships. All of those things can have influences on the sexy graph that goes on the title of the paper that's considered the best fit curve. And that's one of the reasons we included literally every single visual from all of the models that we fitted in the preprint, just to try to highlight that process. Of course, within a 70+ page document, that level of context has been lost across the translation of social media, but I'm trying to do my best to walk things back as much as possible. The point is, the overall relationship does seem to improve as we get closer to failure, but the exact way that curve and that relationship plays out is pretty unstable, influenced by a ton of different factors. And ultimately, as we get more data, and those that actually report proximity to failure correctly could change entirely. So that's just all of that context is just important. And the way that I view it is it's important to understand the overall principle so that when we go to play this optimization game of actually programming for a client, we can do so with the correct information and kind of our pros and cons list. The way that I view how this influences things, for me at least, is that previous conversations would make the claim that 0 RER and 2 RER were basically the same. I think this at least brings some evidence to say that failure may actually be better, but the actual trade-offs there obviously take further things into account to actually go and eventually program that. But I think the decision making is different than if we say a set at 2 RER is absolutely the same as a set to failure. This evidence may give us at least some indication that maybe there's a little bit of additional calculus that needs to happen to say there is a potential benefit of actually going to failure for hypertrophy. Does that play out, or does that meet the conditions that we actually want to make that play in our actual programming? That to me is the kind of the nuts and bolts of the practical application here, is that there's a lot of fuzziness. There's a lot of limitations that went into the analysis overall. But if you take all those things at face value and kind of agree with the limitations and the way things were done, I think it's decent evidence to suggest that we have this overall relationship between RER and hypertrophy, to which we can use that to further take the pros and cons on the individual level that we're programming for, and use that to actually inform our actual RER prescriptions. Throughout the entire paper, we basically never mention a specific RER, and that's to further ingrain this process to think about the entire dose response relationship, its directionality, rather than the super granular comparisons that I think people are getting caught up on with the exponential curve towards failure, at least at the moment. That's my spiel. Hopefully I didn't ramble too much. I don't know if you have any follow-ups there.
No, I wanted to get Josh's thoughts on it. Any thoughts on the takeaways, what they found, and then anything that maybe you see that's people are misapplying, or maybe it's just what Zac said.
No, I definitely second what Zac said. I guess I would maybe underline a couple things. The first is, when you put your researcher hat on, right? I think rightly so, you want to walk back some of the highlight reel takeaways that people are jumping to. And I 1000% agree with Zac. Like, this is not the end all be all. There was an estimation process into this. Myself and Dr. Zordos confirmed we agreed with Zac's estimation process, for example. So like, we did all we could with the research we have, but even though we did all we could, there's a lot of limitations here. Zac mentioned it's a 70-page document. There's a lot of supplementary materials as well that didn't make it into the document as well. So there's just so many limitations here that I don't think you can truly understand unless you go through this process yourself and also have seen what research is actually and see some of the limitations of any individual study. So I think that's helpful to have Zac, who led the analysis, communicate that. But at the same time, I would also make it clear that this has changed the way we think about the topic in general. We don't want to point out the limitations too much to make it seem like this hasn't changed our mind, at least to some degree. Going into this analysis, I don't think any of us expected the best fit model to necessarily look like this. I think we had different expectations. So it has changed our mind and influenced how we personally train and how we coach lifters, and also to some degree how we design training studies going forward to further investigate this question, or just try to get subjects to grow as much as possible when looking at another question, for example. I think you can hold both of those thoughts in your head at the same time. This is very limited, but we feel good about this general relationship existing, and it has influenced how we think about this topic. And it did, to some degree, at least shift our mindset.
I think the important thing is ultimately, like you said, Josh, it's important to communicate on an absolute scale how solid we think it is. But on a relative scale, I do think it's the best we could do. And I think it's probably the most informative thing that we have at the moment. The kind of the perfect analysis 20 years down the line is we have a bunch of studies that report RER very, very well. Failure definitions are very clearly defined. They have average RER, they have the range of RER, they have RER per exercise, per muscle, like all very clear reporting of RER. And then we're able to do the same dose response analysis 20 years down the line with a bunch of studies that report it. And we know exactly those are the RERs in which they train. And maybe that's a completely different results than we find now. But given the tools that we have to our disposal, and given the limitations of making those binary comparisons, those aren't useless by any means. I think these are very much synergistic analyses, which I think is another misinterpretation I think that some people have is they seem to think this analysis is at odds with some of the previous meta-analyses. I think they're very much synergistic. They just look at the question in a different way. And like I said, I do think they basically do agree, in my opinion, because essentially all of the standardized effect sizes are still in favor of the closer to failure condition. It's just when you add a little bit more of these systematic ways of looking at things with the dose response relationship, the overall differences there can change a little bit. But once again, we have a bunch of different studies as well. That's another thing that fails to be taken into account sometimes, is I think we have over double the studies in a lot of the other meta-analyses. Now, you can look at that as a pro or a con. Some of these studies are a little bit different in the way they were designed, and that's probably not a stock standard hypertrophy study. For example, some of the alternative set structure research that uses cluster sets or rest redistribution, some people would look at that and say the way that they are manipulating proximity to failure there is more of a limitation because the rest intervals are maybe not exactly the same. So somebody could look at that and that's a totally reasonable opinion. We were of the mindset in this case to try to get as much data as we could and look at that overall relationship. So yeah, I'm of the same opinion as Josh. I think I'm on the defensive mode when communicating this a lot of the time because I've been put in a few boxes that I don't really think I agree with based on who has taken hold of this analysis and kind of used it as evidence to support their position. Another example that I find very funny with this has been how this has been somehow tied up into advocating for lower training volumes. If anything, our analysis shows that higher volumes and training closer to failure are better, which to me makes sense. Like those both have positive dose response relationships. You basically want to try to optimize how much dose you're doing or the combination of those two factors. So maybe it's a few extra sets with some of those sets at a submaximal RIR, or maybe it's a few less sets with most of those sets being taken to failure, probably somewhere in between those. That is what our analysis suggests, but for some reason, this has been taken as evidence to do less than 10 sets per week. And I just don't really know how that's supported by our data really at all. So there's just a lot of things that we could go into the finer nuances here. But I think the main thing that Josh is saying that I do agree with, and I have a tendency to think about from the opposite direction based on the chatter this has gotten online, is on an absolute scale, this is a pretty limited analysis purely because all of the data is limited. But on a relative scale, I think it was the best we could do. And I think it definitely has informed the way that I've thought about this topic. And I think it is hopefully going to give us a little bit more evidence to think about these overall relationships. And hopefully 20 years down the line, we can do this again and be even more confident.
Yeah, no. So it sounds like, again, you just did the best you could with the information that was out there. And again, like kind of the reps in reserve and the intensity, like how they go about that. It's hard to see exactly where that's at. And so you just had you did the best you could with the information. And so you guys both hit on, hey, it did change. Like it was a little bit different than what we thought. It's also changed how we programmed a little bit. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that. And I know you also said, Josh, you said like how you're going to do research as well too. I don't know if that's from like a RAR standpoint or what that's going to look like, but I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts on that. Either of you can start.
Yeah. So from a research perspective, right, the way I'm thinking about it now, even if this isn't the direct question we're looking at, my dissertation, for example, is relevant here because the research question I'm looking at is not changing or manipulating RIR between the two groups. So I essentially just want each set to be, or I just want each group to grow as much as they can within the constraints of their condition, right? And what I'm leaning towards right now, this isn't finalized, is to essentially train in the 0 to 2 RIR range and have the last set taken to 0 RIR. It'll probably end up being to actual momentary failure, so the inability to complete a rep. I think there's a few benefits to that. The first is, especially for research subjects, for example, we're going to be training the calves in my study, and maybe people aren't used to pushing calf training super hard. And if the last set of every session is taken all the way to momentary failure, that's going to anchor their RIR ratings going forward and ensure that, those 1 or 2 RIR calls they make for future sets are more accurate. And that way we don't have a subject that's been training accidentally at 6 to 7 RIR for the entire study. And I think that generally translates over to probably how we think about this in practice on something like a calf raise or something like a tricep extension, which again are some of the movements that I'll be using for my dissertation study. In that, if there isn't a huge cost to actually taking it to the house, why not? What's the downside? Whereas I think in the past, we didn't have as strong of a reason or as strong of a potential benefit to take it to that point. And essentially it's just the pros and cons on an individual set basis have shifted a little bit. Now, I've found in practice that if you take the first set of an exercise to failure, that can have negative effects for the rest of the session or for the rest of the sets for that exercise. So I think a pretty common protocol I'm writing for a lot of people right now is to take that last set all the way to failure. If it's a really easy exercise to failure on, like a bicep curl or a calf raise. But if it's something like a pull down or a dumbbell bench that, yeah, you could definitely fail on and be fine. There might be it might be slightly unsafe, like a dumbbell bench, something like that, or it might take away from exercises to come that have overlapping muscle groups. Okay, maybe we're hanging out at 2 to 3 RER, and then the last set is 0 to 1 RER. So not actually failing, but getting pretty dang close to that point. So that's what a protocol will look like, or at least a lot of them that we're writing now. I believe Zac is pretty similar, but he can let us know.
Can I ask one question too? You mentioned the cost. Are you talking like from a fatigue standpoint? Is that kind of what you mean? Or is it all those things that you mentioned, like the safety, all those things?
Primarily from a fatigue perspective. Yeah, I think before we probably were of the mindset, and honestly, I think in hindsight, probably got a little bit too wrapped up in the research on the influence of training to failure on fatigue. I think just thinking about it a little bit more, thinking like revisiting that research multiple times. And also Zac has some data from his master's thesis that may eventually be published that is also relevant here as well. Is we just asked ourselves, are we actually applying the same standards to this research that we might for other areas of research in terms of actually accepting this concept that training to failure is just incredibly disproportionately fatiguing compared to non-failure training? And I, of course, think it is more fatiguing, but how much more is the question? And a lot of these studies are not chronic in nature in terms of looking at how training to failure influences fatigue. And if you're used to doing 10 to 20 sets per week all the way to failure, and you do another training week of 10 to 20 sets per week all the way to failure, you're probably going to be fine because you're used to it and you've adapted to it. I think back to being an athlete in high school, right? I'm not saying I was a good athlete, but I was an athlete nonetheless. And a lot of the training I did just completely blows powerlifting or bodybuilding training out of the water. And I felt fine. Now, granted, I was in high school and less stressors, et cetera. So there's definitely some confounders, but I think perhaps before we underestimated what someone can adapt to and can recover from if things are set up in a proper way. So we wouldn't throw someone into all their sets to failure right away, but maybe ease them into it over time and maybe find a sweet spot that's different than where we landed before.
So it sounds like it's, again, you're going to use it in terms of like getting that bearing down for the proper intensity. So just in case somebody's not like super far away from failure, but then also like you're saying we can implement it more because again, it potentially doesn't have as much fatigue as we thought. And so long as it's programmed properly, it's like, why not take it to the house there on that for those reasons?
Yeah.
Martin Ruffalo, he did a study, I think right before the meta regression came out on like the fatigue. And I think his finding was that it was the closer you train to failure, the more fatigue there was, but that was just on that training session. It wasn't like over the long term, correct?
Yeah, I got a few thoughts on this that kind of are relevant, and I'll come back to that. So I think the biggest thing that's changed for me is that surrounding this conversation is that if we accept that there is a potential benefit from training closer to failure versus, let's say, probably the evidence-based recommendation for on average RER is probably going to be 2. I think that's most people would have said that's the case. I'd say previous to the kind of this analysis, maybe revisiting this conversation, maybe some people would have said that 0 RER is definitely has a benefit. I think most people would have said it's relatively similar once you're in the 0 to 2 RER range. And some would even say it's the same. Like there's no additional benefit of going to failure. I think this meta regression somewhat questions that idea to say there may be some sort of benefit. So then the question becomes, what is the cost? Like you guys have already said. I think the biggest thing that's changed in my mind is that cost to me needs to be displayed. That is the biggest thing. And so if you think about the analogous example I think about this with is, let's say I have a female or an older client. There's a ton of different anecdotes surrounding how much training volume either of those populations can handle, such that female clients typically recover from more training volume and older clients typically recover from less training volume. Because those anecdotes exist, I might bias things a little bit in that direction, but for the most part, I'm actually going to program for that client based on the actual responses that I'm seeing from that individual and what they're actually displaying to me. And I think the exact same thing goes with training to failure. There are tons of conversations, tons of acute studies. As Josh said, there's literally one longitudinal study on fatigue with training to failure. And this is a whole nother rabbit hole, but if that is a major concern, that should show up in the longitudinal outcomes, and it just doesn't. There are some counters to that, but in general, it should show up if it's a massive deal, and it doesn't. But ultimately, to me, the biggest thing there is if there is not a reason that is immediately apparent that training to failure is causing massive issues for performance, then I don't think it's a massive concern. I think once you've questioned that premise, at least personally, I've been experimenting with this literally as much as physically possible to see if this is a justifiable position to hold. So I've tried on pretty much every muscle group except quads and hamstrings, which I'm just starting to be able to test that now, of basically taking every single set to like momentary failure and then even lengthened failure past that. So doing partials. And I think if you go in with the mindset that it is possible to get pretty damn close to repeating performance or even repeating performance with a normal rest interval, I think you'd be surprised on how many muscle groups you can do that. And now the case there is, I'm not saying that's going to be the case for everyone. That could be the case that for certain rep ranges, certain exercises, and just certain individuals, that may have way more of a tax for that person than me. But the point is, you're evaluating that in the actual session to see if that's a problem. If your performance is being slashed a ton by taking a set to failure, then I think you can make some modifications and potentially try to find that RAR that allows you to maximize the amount of work done in that close to failure zone without having a massive reduction in performance. So you mentioned the acute study by Ruffalo and colleagues. It's a really solid, probably the best acute study that we have on this. And I believe the difference in the total number of repetitions performed, if I recall correctly, I have it somewhere, I could be wrong, but it's somewhere in like the 7 to 11% range. And like the total number of repetitions performed between the condition taking 6 sets of bench press to momentary failure versus 3 RAR, if I recall. And to me, that's not a massive difference. That, of course, could add up over multiple sessions. But once again, when we actually look at the longitudinal evidence, it doesn't really seem to. So I am just becoming more agnostic about the fatigue thing. And basically, from a practical perspective, I tend to favor training pretty darn close to failure for hypertrophy, if not to it, pretty often, unless there is very strong evidence on the individual level to suggest that's not a good idea. To give a rough number on it, something I've been trying to do is figure out what's like a rough ballpark for when that actually is something you should address. The best kind of tangent area of research I can think of is the rest interval research. So when you look at short rest intervals that do seem to blunt hypertrophy, it seems to be the studies that look at volume load dropping off by about 30%. That seems to when hypertrophy seems to start to be blunted. So if you think about what you're saying there is that if I perform a biceps training session where I'm doing 5 sets of bicep curls, if I do 5 sets to failure, and then I come back the next week and I do those 5 sets to a submaximal RAR, and then I try to stay within a given repetition range, if I look at the volume load there and I'm losing a ton of volume load in that failure condition compared to the RAR condition, that may be solid evidence on the individual level that maybe modifying that RAR a little bit to try to maintain more of that performance may be a good idea. I know for me, I don't think I'd have to drop the load a ton, if at all, to maintain that performance range on a bicep curl, for example, taking like moderate rest intervals. But if you start adding some of those contextual factors in there, maybe you're using a higher repetition range, maybe you're not resting as long, and maybe for you, that's just like a particularly fatiguing experience because you haven't been doing it for very long. All those things can influence how much of a performance drop you could see. So I'm not super holding to that 30% number, but I just feel bad coming on and questioning the fatigue thing and having literally nothing to say on like, okay, how do I know? So that's the best approximation I have at the moment. I don't hold to that very strongly at all, but that kind of seems to be the best tangential area of research we can draw on to give an example where that fatigue problem and what does fatigue mean in the context of hypertrophy to actually negatively affect outcomes. That seems to be the best correlative area there. So yeah, I don't know, Josh, I don't know if you think anything different on that, but that's a thing I have to say on the whole fatigue stuff.
No, that's super interesting. So again, it sounds like the biggest thing you would do there is, again, instead of just saying, hey, like failure is going to have a ton of fatigue, it's ultimately, what is that kind of person responding to, and is their performance dropping or not? And that's going to be your biggest indicator there with that. And you'll take that with multiple muscle groups. Like you said, maybe for somebody, bicep curl, either they're good to go. But you do something like a leg press, that's obviously going to change things a little bit potentially. So you need to take that into consideration there. But with this meta regression, again, showing that, hey, the closer you get to failure, the better. This is why, or more muscle growth, this is why you're leaning towards pushing people towards that more often than not now than maybe you would have in the past. And again, I think the fatigue was the big thing there. And I know for me, that was always the big thing, was like, oh, the fatigue cost. But then it's what is that though?
Yeah. And I think I try to stay pretty open-minded to it. I know there's a couple people out in the wild that have been talking about this for a while and not valuing the fatigue comparisons and research a ton. And there's a ton of people that take pretty much every set to failure, and even training with like moderate to high volume. So like that to me and seem to be getting enough progress. And that to me is at least enough evidence to come into that idea with a clean slate and rethink everything. And I think Josh hammered on it. The epistemic standard, or the amount of evidence that we would need to form a strong belief about hypertrophy, proximity to failure, and fatigue, if we hold the same standard that we would for literally anything else, we really don't have strong evidence to like strongly question that as a factor that's going to really negatively influence outcomes. Now, we have pretty strong like prior beliefs from our experience in the trenches doing this. Everyone's done a Widowmaker set of squats, doing puking afterwards. And that's like I think that's one thing I find interesting in this conversation is if I could take a magical machine that could to extract what you're imagining when I say training to failure, I would say over 90% of people are thinking a high rep set of either hack squats or back squats. And I think that potentially pollutes this conversation slightly, because I do think that is just a completely different thing than 80% of the other muscles in the body and how we would normally train those. And so I think that actually may end up being the exception, not the rule, if that makes sense. So I'm not saying that I don't think it exists. It absolutely does. In my experience, it does. It's just the degree to which that's the case. Can we adapt to it? And then what does it mean for fatigue to negatively influence hypertrophy? We can draw up all these really cool physiological mechanisms that theoretically decrease motor unit recruitment and don't allow mechanical tension to fast twitch fibers and like all these cool things that we can speculate. But if that was really the case, you would expect that to be followed up by the longitudinal outcomes. And I think the biggest kind of caveat people have with the longitudinal outcomes in comparison to doing those in practice, which Dr. Helms has mentioned this a few times on a couple different podcasts, is just the number of training sessions per week and in the overall volumes. And I think that's a really fair comeback. But if we're talking about just what's the best we have, I would still come back to the fact that we just don't have evidence to say it's a huge problem at the moment. It definitely could be. There could be a couple studies that come out in really well-trained individuals training 6 days a week and kind of measuring multiple muscle groups. And that could expose some issues of training a ton of muscles to close proximities to failure that more reflect what intermediate and advanced individuals training for hypertrophy do in the gym. And I'm absolutely open to that in my mindset. I guess I just come in with a much more, man, we don't know much about the longitudinal influences of hypertrophy and fatigue, because we have one longitudinal study that I'm aware of, my master's thesis, which isn't published currently, but also questions the degree to which this stuff matters with proximity to failure. And then we have a bunch of acute evidence that suggests this is a thing, but man, I care about what happens in 5 years, not a single training session. And I know just from doing this for, a couple months following when we put this out, I've substantially adapted to taking a set to failure. Rows is the first thing I'm imagining. Like I did a kind of myo rep 5 set thing the other day where I took every single set, like I said, to momentary failure with partials and stuff. And I was tired for sure. And it was a very exhausting little bird of effort there, but it wasn't like this soul crushing thing where I couldn't come back and train the next day that I think even maybe a previous version of myself would have believed. So I think that's just maybe something to come in with a fresh slate and make that experience proven to you on the individual level, to say this is definitely an issue because I just had to reduce the load by 30%, something like that, as opposed to saying, if I do this set to failure, my entire session is ruined. Like I just am starting to question that to be the case.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think again, just seeing how you respond to it is going to be the big thing there. Is there anything else you guys want to hit on with this particular topic, or anything maybe that we left out? Josh, was there anything you wanted to wrap up or anything?
Just one quick comment that I think just adds to what we were saying is that in a lot of this fatigue research, they're quantifying fatigue 24, 48, 72 hours post. often using something like vertical jump or other measurements of more power oriented outcomes, such as they'll find the load that corresponds with a given velocity at pre-testing, but it's usually a very fast velocity. So like 1 meter per second. Anyone that's used velocity-based training knows that's very fast. And then you use that load again at post-testing and see how fast you move it. And yeah, if you train to failure 48 hours earlier, sure, you might not move that load quite as fast, but is that actually indicative of the hypertrophy stimulus you can receive in that given session 48 hours later? I would question that, right? And that's the arc of a researcher. We show up to Florida Atlantic University, we're fired up to be researchers. We're like, oh, this paper from this cited individual measured this outcome, which is fine. It's an awesome study, but they're saying it measures fatigue. So thus, oh, we're looking at this fatigue measurement. It goes down. They're more fatigued. That's bad, right? And then you get some more experience. You think through it a little bit more. You get some more practical experience. Maybe you see, oh, maybe there is a pro of actually going all the way to failure or closer to failure. Okay, let's revisit that. And now I think we're at a different spot now.
Yeah, I think if anybody's looking for a master's thesis project, I think a fatigue study that'd be really interesting, even an acute one, is looking at, because what Josh is basically saying is that the way people measure fatigue probably isn't indicative of hypertrophic potential of a session. That's ultimately what we care about in this context. So I think something that could be interesting that would illustrate what we'd be looking for in comparison to what's been done is taking like the ability to elicit anabolic signaling pre and 48 hours post training to failure, pre 48 hours post training with a submaximal RIR approach. That would indicate to me, at least that'd be the best thing I could think of at the moment, to say there is some sort of physiological cost that may lead to less longitudinal hypertrophy acutely because we're not able to stimulate the biochemical pathways associated with muscle growth. Something like that to me would be better evidence in the hypertrophy conversation than how fast can we move a very submaximal load, how high can we jump, how many reps can we do with a given load. Like those kind of things are interesting and represent performance decrement, but performance decrement doesn't automatically lead to less hypertrophic potential of a session, which I think is the tough thing when we talk about fatigue. I think strength's a little bit more straightforward because performance literally is the adaptation, right? So it's a little bit more straightforward to evaluate, but nonetheless, it makes things a little bit trickier when we think about muscle growth.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, strength's a little bit easier to figure out there with that because, like you said, it's a little bit more straightforward. And we don't have to talk about this, but I would imagine too things like outside of the gym are going to play a huge role in the recovery as well too, in terms of sleep, stress management, nutrition are all going to have a role in that as well too. So just to add another layer of complexity to it. Cool. No, it was really cool to hear your guys' thoughts on that and to clear up some maybe confusion that people have about this study or the meta regression.
If you don't mind, I'm curious,
man.
how has it? It seems like you're pretty in tune with kind of the conversation in the line. Just heard what we said. I'm curious to hear, has this changed your perspective on the topic at all? How has it changed your approach to, clients, that kind of thing? I'm curious.
Honestly, very similar to you guys, right? Like people I've talked to, like I told you, I talked to Steve Hall about it. I talked to Eric Helms about it, Brian Borstein. Brian had me train in this way a little bit closer to failure before this as well too. But yeah, same thing where it's just been like, just pushing people a little bit closer to failure versus more in the tank and just thinking that that's the right way to go. Right. So very similar to you guys that I want to push clients closer to failure now to this. And again, maybe it comes down to focusing more on things outside of the gym versus more stressing about, oh, you're training close to failure, so let's keep you further away from failure. Now you're leaving a ton in the tank. But it's really, you need to get everything else outside of the gym.
That's a really good point that I think it's just so interesting when we have these conversations that often are subject to getting so far in the weeds. But if you think about a pie chart of the things that are going to go into preventing excessive fatigue, training with 2 versus 0 RIR, I think is going to be such a small sliver in comparison to all the other things that go on that pie chart, yet probably receives the majority of the attention just because those other things are so simple, obviously. And it does play a role, of course, but it's interesting to me. Yeah. Like how easy it is to escape those big rocks in this conversation that I think thinking about strategies to maximize sleep quality, maximize your ability to consistently hit a high protein intake, stuff like that that's just like an interesting, sobering reminder of keeping in perspective what's going to make a massive difference in how those things work, rather than dealing in these kind of, like we've talked about, potentially uncertain small things that maybe we're not really sure about. So it's a good reminder there.
Yeah, like you said, is it 2 RAR or 0 RAR? Is that going to make that big of a difference? But again, as you guys, I'm sure you guys can relate to this. Like most people probably stay further away from failure than they think, anyways. With hypertrophy training, it also reminds me of the concurrent training too, where there was this big thing like, oh, if you do any amount of cardio, you're going to lose all your muscle. But it's like also what's the programming like? What's your nutrition like? What's your recovery like? That's going to play a big role there. Yeah, no, it's awesome. I can't wait to see more stuff on this. Like you said, hopefully now in 10, 20 years, we'll have even more, and you can do an even better meta regression on this with more evidence available and whatnot. So do you guys have time to run over another topic, or cool? I wanted to talk again, Zac. I told you this was going to be, I think last time it was more Josh's articles. Now this time we're going to go a little bit more towards Zac's, but I know you guys both have a ton of insight into it. I know you did one on mixing loading ranges for muscle growth. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, maybe what the research says around there. I know coming in, something I preach is 5 to 30 reps is that. And in the research, what we look at there from hypertrophy is that kind of sweet area. I'm sure you can probably tighten it even more than that, but I'm curious to hear what you found and your guys' thoughts around this topic.
Yeah, for sure, man. So I think this is a good kind of topic to talk about an issue in research that's at large. We see. So the thing that we went into this article thinking were, okay, load doesn't seem to matter for hypertrophy, or the rep ranges you train with don't seem to matter too much for hypertrophy, such that, like you said, you take all the sets to failure, sets of 5 all the way up to 30 roughly seem to lead to equivalent growth. But the question there is, if we look at a study that compares high load versus low load, oftentimes it's this either or approach, right? And so probably more interestingly, in practice, we're using these approaches that kind of mix approaches rather than only utilizing one of them. And so that was what we were interested with this article was, let's take a look at all the studies that have comparison to like kind of stock standard hypertrophy training, that moderate loading range, moderate rep range, take those sets close to failure, versus these other conditions where they mix loading ranges. So they're taking some sets with high loads, some sets with low loads, and does that by combining these things that potentially, big caution flag here, potentially have additive mechanisms of some kind. Does that lead to better hypertrophy, which is actually what people do in practice? To give the headline thing there, there's a lot of limitations to the kind of the way that we pooled things here. This data is not very clean by any means, but it does seem that if you do mixed rep ranges, there may be a small benefit. Big caveat there that there's one study that really seems to weigh on things there a good amount, and some of the studies use blood flow restriction that we separately analyze, and those seem to tell a little bit different story than the other ones. So there's a good amount of limitations here, but to me, it's once again neutral to positive evidence to suggest that mixing loading ranges is probably a good idea. There doesn't seem to be a strong reason to suggest it'd be a bad idea. And then if anything, this seems to be small positive evidence to suggest that there may be a little bit of a benefit there in terms of actually training in multiple repetition ranges, as opposed to just choosing that entirely based on preference, if that makes sense, which is the way that we thought about it prior to looking through this. For the most part, there's logistical reasons you may want to pick one rep range versus the other. Lateral raises, you're probably not doing sets of 5 on, although that has become popular as of late, I've been told, and versus doing sets of 30 on squats, right? There's the logistical reasons you might choose certain rep ranges, but for the most part, it's been painted as personal preference for the most part. And so I think this gives a little bit of credence to the idea that kind of mixing loading ranges a little bit maybe is a little bit of a neutral to positive idea with potentially additive mechanisms kind of occurring there, although we can't really speculate on those too much.
Josh, did you have any follow-ups to that or anything like that? Anything that you found from the research? Or
No, I think that you can just add this one to the pile of neutral to positive effects. And I think that leads to just a more philosophical discussion of what does the individual want? What are the costs of each of these decisions? Because there are a lot of other things, right? There's a lot of supplements that we have acute research on, but we don't have longitudinal research on, right? We can keep things simple and just say, pick up the dumbbells as long as you get 5 reps and you take it to pretty close to failure, you're going to be fine. But someone may be looking to get that extra edge, might want to be a little bit more precise or calculated with things. And there's a lot of things in that pile, which I think is worth keeping in mind, right? This isn't unique in that way. Getting BFR bands, for example, right? There's a cost to that. There's also a learning curve to that. There's a lot of discomfort that comes to that, right? We don't really have enough research to say whether doing a few sets of those per week will have additive hypertrophy. From the research we have so far, doesn't really seem to have a specific effect when adding BFR. But there's also, like Zac said, it's messy. I think when you take an honest look at a lot of the research, a lot of things fall in this category.
So again, I guess some of the takeaways of this would be like, if you are maybe just spending like most of your training in one particular rep range, like just say 5 to 10, there might be some benefit and some additive benefit of training in 10 to 15, 15 to 20. Is that kind of what you would say there? Or am I just maybe overly making, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably the case. I think if I was going to be as speaking to the evidence as possible, which again is very limited, what you said is perfectly defensible position. And I would say that'd be what I would put my money on, is that there's kind of a spectrum of kind of, if we hit in all these kind of different rep ranges, there's probably a neutral to positive effect there. Specifically speaking from the evidence, it seems that there's probably like these higher load sets and then higher to moderate load sets that are going to make up the bulk of your training, but then adding in a few of these like pretty darn low load sets could be a pretty good idea. So that is the way that I think about it for the most part, is spend most of your time in that kind of 6 to 15 range or what have you. And then it may be a neutral positive effect to include some of those sets where we're breaking into the 20, 30 ranges. The way that I think about it with this, it is, like I said, limited. And some of the studies are using load rather than rep ranges, so we don't really know how many reps they got, stuff like that. And BFR is also included in this, so 30% of 1RM plus BFR. What's that load with straight weight? It's hard to approximate exactly, but that's the way that I think about it, is that when I say mixing rep ranges, you got the bulk your hypertrophy training in kind of this moderate to low rep zone, and then sprinkling in some of that higher rep stuff, I think is going to be a good idea. And then that kind of first part of the equation is going to be exercise dependent, preference dependent, that kind of stuff. That'd be the way that I would think about it.
Cool. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Is there any like particular ways that you would program this or anything like that for clients?
It's tough. I think Josh, fill the air. I'm going to look up the article now.
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways you could go about this, right? You could have, if someone's training arms 3 times a week, you could have like BFR day, right, to effectively train with lower loads. However, the one thing about BFR, and I think this concept is worth considering, and this might also be relevant for something like drop sets, and that is that using a BFR band effectively makes a given load heavier, because the number of reps you can do with that lighter load decreases because of the occlusion that the bands provide. So anyway, that's a reason to believe that maybe something like drop sets aren't the best way to get these benefits. We can't say that for sure, but I think there's some degree of indication of that from the research. So I have experimented with this on myself and on clients. And basically my application of it was to essentially just add a light load, high rep set after kind of the normal work, or in some cases, just replace the last set with a lighter load, high rep set. I remember texting Zac about this after I finished the block doing it. I was like, dude, that was not very fun, because you're doing sets of 8 to 12. Yeah, it's uncomfortable, even if you're training to failure, but it's really not anything like doing a set of 25 to 35 on lat pull down to failure. Like, weird things just start to fatigue, and it's hard for me to tell for sure like how successful it's been, but I haven't felt that the juice was worth the squeeze in terms of that specific application, just because of how much it made me dread that last set. But if you are interested in applying this and giving it a shot, or maybe you come from an endurance background and you have much better cardiovascular fitness than me, and it's no big deal, that would be how I would do it, is just replace last set of an exercise or something like that with a later load set. And you're going to want to take it very close, if not to failure, with that later load.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think the approach that I talked about in the article was basically back off sets, which is either progressively decreasing the load set to set, like starting with the top set of a lower rep range, then going to like a moderate load set, and then finishing off with one of those really low load sets like Josh talked about, or doing all your work in kind of your main rep range and then following that up with that one final set. As Josh said, I think I just looked through the outcomes. I think pretty much every one of the studies included here used knee extensions as the exercise. That's probably part of what's going on here, is that very controlled conditions in a chair, like doing sets of 30 on that is going to be obviously uncomfortable for your quads, but like in terms of like funny stuff that can occur, probably isn't going to have too much. Whereas like Josh's example on the lat pull down, there's just a lot more kind of horizontal translation that can occur with those lighter loads, stuff like that. So that maybe is a consideration on the exercise. You may want to do this pretty stable exercises, fixed pass, stuff like that. But in general, that's how I would apply it as well, is basically, I don't want to call it a burnout set as the like in a total bro way, but that's what you're doing, is you do your main work. You maybe decline your RIR and your kind of 3 main sets from 2, 1, 0. You hit your really solid performance set on your main rep range, and then you maybe burn it out with a set with a pretty darn low load, shooting for somewhere in like 25 rep range to failure. And then, yeah, that's going to be pretty cool session. The bros will be impressed at the gym and you can walk out with a nice pump.
I love it. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And again, just a good way to change up your training and just throw in something maybe a little bit different too. Real quick on supersets, is that, I feel like I get a lot of questions on supersets. Do you think that's a viable strategy for people with hypertrophy? And if so, is there any, do you find that same muscle group supersets or opposite? Is there any best way to potentially apply that as well?
Yeah, I don't think we have any data on hypertrophy yet for supersets that I'm aware of, particularly agonist supersets or like the paired muscle groups. There may be one. I could be wrong about that.
There may be one, but also if there is, there's not much.
Yeah, it's 0 or 1. I'm almost positive, but anyway, I honestly think it's a great strategy from the acute data for the most part. If you're doing kind of a muscle groups that oppose one another, it's going to maintain performance pretty well. So you're not going to have a massive loss in performance. It's extremely time efficient. So purely for that reason, I think it's permissive to higher volumes. And so long as there's not a massive cost to doing that from a fatigue perspective, which once again, I would evaluate that on like, do I feel like I'm substantially fatigued in this case? Is my performance dropping off a ton using supersets in comparison to not using supersets? From my experience, if you are seeing that your performance is declining a ton, I would say you're probably screwing up the superset in some way, because in my experience, it's honestly been extremely favorable for time efficiency, tolerating higher volumes in a given amount of time, all those kind of things. So I use that pretty much as my standard approach for the most part. Like I'll maybe have an exercise or a muscle group that I'm trying to prioritize in a session that I'll hit with full rest intervals, but for the most part, particularly for muscle groups that I don't think aren't like a huge cardiovascular demand, like Smith squats, for example, something like that. You maybe don't want to do this on back work, bicep work, all those kind of things. Like supersets are pretty much my standard approach to just pair that with something else. Maybe you're able to get 6 sets in the same time you would do 3, that kind of thing. It just allows you to tolerate more weekly training volume in my experience and keep moving in the session as well. I find you're able to stay focused a little bit better, at least in my experience. You sit down, your mind wanders a little bit. And it's also something you adapt to. I think people can be pretty whipped the first time you do it, like doing back work and then going over and doing dumbbell bench and trying to hit those both close to failure. I think initially could be and if you haven't been training close to failure initially, that's like a double whammy of something you're not adapted to if you're making a bunch of changes after listening to this podcast. So giving that some time to adapt to run its course and get used to is something that I think is probably important. I will say I pretty much only use supersets as my form of like cardiovascular exercise at the moment. And I got a nice little 56 resting heart rate the other day at the doctor. So that was pretty cool. So I don't know, maybe my cardiovascular health from superset is doing okay. I did feel pretty terrible at the pace that I do them at initially, but nowadays I feel pretty good. What you sitting at, boss?
I'm sitting at 50 right now, and I don't do supersets because I
50
do just have
50 is like really low, isn't it?
I've always had like an oddly low resting heart rate, especially being at peak bulk right now. I do get a lot of the notifications on the Apple Watch. It's, your heart rate's below 40 beats per minute. You should probably check this out. So I had to turn that off.
Man, I feel like we're going to get flamed from some doctors. Maybe we're like talking about something that's not even
Yeah.
I feel like resting heart rate must not be related to cardiovascular fitness at all then. If we're both,
I think there is a component, but I believe we're not cardiovascular physiologists.
You think you're just a freak or what?
Yeah, I was born to run basically, but just because it bothers me to potentially have been wrong in the quads and hip pairing, agonist antagonist paired sets that looked at hypertrophy, similar outcomes, and then there's also one for strength where they did squat and bench in that fashion, and they saw similar strength outcomes. So there are a couple studies it's been a minute since I've looked at those. But yeah, while I was looking at those, I didn't listen to what Zac said. I think I know his thoughts on them, and he does do them. I can vouch for it, and I do it when it's convenient. And it's I think it's the way to go when there's like for hypertrophy. I think it's probably a good default, to be honest. I'd say the biggest issue is logistics, right? Is sitting on the Smith machine and the cable machine to do rows and incline Smith press, for example. Like it can just not be practical, but if you train at home or whatever the case may be, or have an empty gym, I think it's an excellent default strategy. Some research even indicates that it can improve performance on the antagonist muscle, but it's probably unlikely that you're going to jump right to the antagonist set, which is often when they notice that in the research. So I wouldn't do it for that reason. That is something interesting that could be a benefit.
Pretty much what I do is, unless you have unlimited time, which we're pretty big on saying there's time constraints for pretty much everybody. It's just how do they manifest, right? I basically go, if I have the time, hit it with straight sets, full rest intervals if possible. If I don't have the time, but I basically always program a way that easily allows for supersets to basically just happen, hit supersets to save time to get the session in. And then if that doesn't work and the logistics don't work with the two machines, then just go to myo reps with the same rep range, same protocol, same RIR, literally everything. You're just taking shorter rest intervals to get there. Basically, that's pretty much my approach for hypertrophy in that order.
So it may be like, again, just save time. And then I guess too, maybe at the end, if there's any, maybe just muscle groups that aren't like super, super important to you, like probably going to be another reason to potentially use those. But it sounds like the time aspect of it's probably the biggest one there with the
100%.
supersets, which, hey, like you said, most people have that problem with the time. So cool. A ton of great information in here, guys. Appreciate your time as always. Is there anything that maybe we missed or you want to lead the audience to hear before I let you guys go?
Nah, man. Appreciate being on as always. That was a fun conversation. Thank you for giving your insights on the big project. I always like to hear in the trenches people's interpretation of it, what we could do better going forward, that kind of stuff. So just appreciate you having us on and had a great chat.
Yep. Thank you for coming on. Josh, anything where you want to lead the audience to or anything?
If you're interested in looking at some of our work, including the meta regression that Zac led, you can just Google like Zac Robinson ResearchGate or Josh Pelland ResearchGate, and our ResearchGate profiles will come up, and you can see that preprint as well as some of our other stuff. And you can also keep an eye on that for some of the stuff will be coming out from us in the future on the research side. And then if you're interested in some of the free content we put out that's not for scientific publications, you can find that on our Instagram pages. I'm Josh.datadrivenstrength and Zac is Zac.datadrivenstrength. And we also are getting rolling with our YouTube channel. So give us a subscribe there if you're interested. We talked solely about hypertrophy. We definitely are very interested in hypertrophy, but we're equally interested in strength. So if you are on the strength side of things, you might be interested in some of our other content because we definitely keep tabs on that side of the things as well. But yeah, it was a pleasure, man. And we hope to do it again sometime. And thanks for having us on.
Yeah, absolutely. The YouTube channel will be awesome. And you guys have like a power building, is it programming as well too? So if somebody wants to combine both of them as well, I'm assuming that's something that you guys probably are very well versed in as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's like my average client and also ideal client is someone that has both of those goals, because it's a fun puzzle to combine both of them, both the strength and the hypertrophy side of things.
Cool. Yeah, I'll have to have you back on here again to have you guys on to chat about that. I think that'll be a super interesting conversation to talk about power building. Cause like you said, I feel like that's what a lot of people want that. They want both. Finding out ways to do that the best way would be super interesting. So again, appreciate your guys' time and we'll chat with you next time.
Take care. Thanks, Jeff.